Welcome back to Behind the Bar with me, Cara Devine. In this episode, we're going to take a look at what makes an Irish whiskey, an Irish whiskey, which sadly means I'm going to have to crack open a couple of these bottles and try them out. But it's a sacrifice I am prepared to make for you. As we've discussed in our look at the history of Irish whiskey, this noble spirit has suffered from a bit of an identity crisis for most of the past 100 years. I've had many interactions, such as someone asking me for a Scotch and ginger ale, and then when I ask them which Scotch they're after, they'll respond very confidently, Jameson's. I've also been assured on various different occasions that Irish whiskey is all unpeated, triple distilled, or must be made with unmalted barley, and so on, all of which are true for some, but not all Irish whiskies. So, let's get to the facts and the tax. Please don't stop watching, I promise we'll drink some whiskey soon and we can forget all about taxes. Irish whiskey has a very similar legal definition to Scottish whiskey, so it must be distilled and matured on Ireland from a mash of either entirely malted cereal or malted cereal and other whole grains, and aged for at least 3 years. So much, so obvious. But maybe the easiest way to look at the range of styles available is to debunk some myths. Before we go any further, thanks to our supporters Ralph, Stephen, Sarah, John, Anurag, Josephine, Chris, Bernd, Clarice and Wilson. They've all signed up to our Patreon. If you'd like to join them, there is a link below. No. Irish whiskey can be both single malt, so 100% malted barley from one distillery, or blended, a mix of malted barley and grain spirit. Both of these are seen in Scotland too, but there's also a third entirely Irish way, and that is single pot still whiskey. This is where the tax comes in. Irish whiskey was big business, and the British government were certainly going to profit from that, so heavy taxes were imposed, including one on malted barley. Not ones to be taken advantage of, Irish distillers saw a loophole and began using both malted and unmalted or green barley. Luckily, this actually tasted delicious. It also, as the name suggests, has to be distilled in a pot still, rather than a column still, so this gives like a heavier, kind of more chewy spirit. This is the one truly unique Irish style defined by law, but not all Irish whiskey is made like this, and it actually fell out of fashion for a while. But some brands, such as Redbreast and also the Spot, so green spot, yellow spot, etc., kept it going. And some of the newer distilleries are revisiting this traditional style, which is definitely a fun one to try and find because it's got a really unique flavour. This makes me happy. So it's really interesting because of that green barley, you do get kind of obviously enough, some quite green flavors. So it's really quite apple and pear on the nose. And then it's got like a lovely little spice on the palate, but it is more savory. That is balanced out in Redbreast because it is finished partially in sherry barrels. So you get this kind of lovely lingering sweetness. But yeah, definitely a little bit kind of like spicier and more savory than you might expect, again, an Irish whiskey to be. But it is still nice and fresh and easygoing. It's definitely not as kind of like big and funky as, you know, a lot of Scottish single malts. So it's a really lovely kind of in-between style, plenty of character, but still super smooth. Quite juicy actually. Absolutely one of my favourite Irish whiskies. If you can get your hands on it, then do yourself a favour because it's delicious. The next one we're going to have a little look at is Teeling's. So this is actually a single grain whiskey. So you may remember this name from our history section. John Teeling is the man who really kick-started the resurgence of a lot of old whiskey brands, as well as plenty of new ones from the Cooley distillery, and his sons are continuing on the family tradition. So they were first bottling Cooley stock, but they've now opened a distillery and are laying down their own whiskey. They like to say that they marry tradition and ingenuity, so while they have a single pot still, single malt and blended, they also have this single grain. And no, if you've been paying attention, that doesn't mean that it's only made from one grain, but it's made at one distillery from 100% grain. So in this case, 95% corn and 5% malted barley. And it's distilled on a continuous still, which gives it a bit more of a kind of light and bright body. So this is essentially the kind of whiskey which would be blended with single malt, and that makes a blended whiskey. But just obviously bottling it by itself is pretty interesting, especially when it's such a good example of it. So, I mean, probably going to overuse the word smooth in the course of this episode, but it is really kind of smooth, little bit of like that kind of malty, very small amount of malty character. But yeah, that lovely kind of corn sweetness, and actually a really good, nice long finish. Definitely interesting enough to drink by itself, but also mixes really well, and it's not super expensive, so a one to look out for. Not necessarily. It is true that most commercial whiskies through the boom of Irish whiskey were unpeated, and this probably contributed to its mass appeal, because obviously peat can be a bit divisive. But rural Ireland actually has as many peat bogs as Scotland does, I would imagine. So it would definitely have been used in smaller scale and illegal distilleries historically. Connemara has been the only one for a while now, but with the rise in craft distilling, there's definitely a lot of peated whiskey being laid down. So expect a boom in the coming years, and I, for one, am excited. So Connemara is also a single malt, or rather, is a single malt. We haven't actually looked at a single malt yet, and it's double distilled. So there is going to be more on that later, but it does mean that it comes across on the nose like, yeah, it's got a really kind of quite nice big presence. It's still heaps of fruit. You can definitely smell the peat, like there is that little hint of smoke, but it's not, it doesn't smack you in the face in any way. It's lovely because it's really soft. Yeah, still quite kind of a ripe fruit kind of entry, and then the peat does come through, and so you get this nice, like almost slightly kind of salty little tang at the end that basically just what makes you want to go back for more. I do often recommend this if people are kind of just dipping their toes into the world of peated whiskey, because it's quite soft, you know, compared to your bigger kind of Islas and things, but it's definitely there, so it's quite a good one to sort of, if you're just training yourself to be able to pick out that flavour without it being, yeah, in any way harsh or scary. Also a really excellent drop. Good question, and this is certainly a useful distinction in understanding why a lot of Irish whiskies taste the way they do, but it's not a legal requirement, and there have actually always been Irish whiskies which are not triple distilled, like Connemara for instance. Essentially, every time you distill, you're concentrating the alcohol, but also removing heavier, more water-soluble compounds. So only the lighter, more fruity flavors make it through each round of distillation. And this is why vodkas will often boast about how many times they've been distilled, because it's obviously seen as desirable for vodkas to be clean and bright and fresh. It is usually done on a column still, so a little bit different again, but it does help to illustrate the point that triple distilled whiskey can be expected to be lighter, brighter, and more elegant maybe than double distilled. Ireland isn't the only country to have triple distilled whiskey though. You've got places like Auchentoshan in Scotland or Woodford Reserve in the States. They're both triple distilled, but a lot of the household Irish names are triple distilled and known for their smoothness. So this can be true either of blends such as Jameson's or any of these three actually, but also for instance Bushmills do a single malt which is also triple distilled. Now, Jameson is a blend of both triple distilled pot still whiskey, and I hope you've been paying attention and remember what that is, otherwise you'll have to hit rewind, and triple distilled grain whiskey. So it's been around continuously since 1780 and is the biggest selling Irish whiskey in the world, so it's understandable that for many, this is the quintessential taste of Irish whiskey. It is matured in both bourbon and sherry casks, and it all just kind of amounts to a really mellow, easygoing, slightly sweet drop. Easy to see why it's so many bartenders' shot of choice as it goes down a little bit too easily. And it's also really good if you do prefer to drink your whiskey with a mixer because it's not going to clash with anything. It's basically just really likeable, like pretty much every Irish person I know. So again, just pretty soft and fruity nose, like especially obviously going from the Connemara back to this, it's not really jumping out the glass at me particularly. Tastes like Jameson. Really nice malt character, definitely has, you know, that kind of lovely like biscuity sort of shortbready vibe. Also kind of into your warmer citrus fruits, so sort of your oranges, like again, quite a juicy and sort of easygoing dram. You know, I think it's one of those things people quite often like to disparage larger, kind of more commercially produced whiskies and things, but there's also a reason that they're popular. Nobody's not going to like that if you stick that down in front of them. You almost don't really have to think about it drinking it, and sometimes you just don't want to have to think about it, and that's fine. So now we've dispelled some myths, what's next for Irish whiskey? It's actually a really exciting time because obviously the industry was basically obliterated and then dominated by only a couple of well-known brands. So there's a real jostle for sort of innovative distillers to establish themselves in this newly lucrative market. So you have lots of people using peat or double distilling, using different grains and different barrels. Basically, in 10 years' time, there will probably be as wide a flavour spectrum of Irish whiskey as there is of Scottish, in fact, if not more. And I'm definitely looking forward to it. But we do already have some fun stuff arriving on the market, so something like the Kinahans KASC Project. Kinahans was one of those distilleries that disappeared in the dark days of Irish whiskey, but it has been rebooted, and while it's also releasing more classic single malts, they're doing kind of experimental things, like this blend, which has been aged in 5 different types of wood. So you've got your standard American and French oak, but also Hungarian, Portuguese oak, and chestnut wood. Definitely has a nice bit of weight to it, especially for what is a blended whiskey, which I'm assuming kind of comes from that nice cask influence there. A little bit of tannin, which is interesting, kind of seeing the oak in it, which gives it a nice bit of structure, but still kind of super smooth and approachable. If you do like your kind of easier going dram, something like a Jameson, Tullamore Dew, that sort of thing, then this would definitely be like a bit of a level up in terms of sort of depth of flavor and intensity of flavor without getting into anything too full on. Really, really yummy. So obviously that's Kinahans kind of playing around with the barrel finishing on it. You also see other people playing with the actual sort of mash bill. So someone like Cobegan has what they call the Cobegan rye. It's not 100% rye, but it does have quite a high proportion of rye in there. Obviously we tend to think of that as being more the preserve of America, although we are also making some cracking ryes in Australia too now, but it's just fun to be playing around. Obviously that's going to have a bit of that sort of rye spice and dryness to it. Which is again a bit of a departure from your more classic, Irish whiskey, soft and malty, floral kind of vibes. So it's just a really fun time to be drinking Irish whiskey, and only going to get more interesting, I think. So also you've got things like Poitin, if I'm saying that correctly. Can't be called whiskey because it's not been aged for 3 years. It's essentially the Irish version of like a white dog unaged spirit. Obviously with all of the kind of new distilleries coming through, whiskey does just take a while. A lot of distilleries start making gin in the interim to sort of tide them over until their whiskey's ready to drink. But this is something else that you can do, is just bottle your new make. And this one is really yum as well, like quite kind of weighty on the palate. Definitely put a little bit of a dent in that one through lockdown. And really cool to use in cocktails as well for sort of that malty character without, or I guess, like cereal forward sort of character without all the other layers of flavor that aging adds in. Basically, it's really a category to watch, and it's great to see the folks who gave us whiskey in the first place being properly recognized again. Do you have an old favorite or a newcomer to watch out for? Definitely let me know in the comments, and make sure to hit the notification bell, because now I've got to sit about chatting and drinking whiskey for a while, I should probably earn my keep and show you how to make some drinks with the stuff. Irish whiskey, so now you know. Slange.